Okay, we are back with another bad presentation, single take. Let's go. Let's have a rant about a particular subject. I'm not that interested in teaching history. I am not that great at history myself, but I do like to be aware of the different trends historically that have happened, especially because even though history doesn't repeat itself, it often rhymes. So it's very useful to use history to try and figure out where we're going. I mentioned last time the fact that pretty much whoever has the reserve currency is the hegemon or the superpower in the world. And I also mentioned that the current system with the current reserve currency is coming to an end. So I thought it would be good to have a look at some of the other reserve currencies, have a look at what their declines look like, where we can draw parallels with the current decline, and also try and figure out kind of where we are within that decline. This is a map showing over the last 500 plus years who had the world reserve, and surprise, surprise, whoever did here was the most powerful nation at that time. And obviously, one causes the other, but I'm not going to argue as to which way around it is. But we're going to explore quickly the rise of the pound and Britain as the um, world power, then what its decline looked like, and then at the end, just see if we can draw some parallels. So let's have a go. The journey up to 1815. So before it was the French livre, I think it was the currency which was the dominant reserve currency, the dominant currency, sorry, and France was the dominant power as well. That all ended in the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815, I believe, and that kind of cemented the downfall of France and uh, the way up for Britain and the pound, and led to I think it's what the century of empire it's called, or the century of yeah, I think it's the empiric century, but it's basically the century where Britain ruled the world, a little bit like how the US has since about 1940. But what did it look like? So, war was kind of the final nail which cemented the pound. We also had something called Pax Britannica, but essentially, Britain would um, rule and control all of the different trade routes, would allow for quote unquote freer trade, but would essentially control all the trade ways and navigation, and would basically be the law of the land. And it's a little bit like how right now we have the US centered rules based order where the US kind of creates all the rules and everyone else has to listen to them, and they dictate free trade and liberalism and all of this stuff. So that version back then was Pax Britannica. And what's quite interesting is obviously now we're seeing the breakdown of the rules based order and uh, the liberal ideas. So but that was Pax Britannica 1815 till 1915. Britain was also known as the workshop of the world. It was pretty much the place where all of the raw resources would go to then be turned into more enhanced goods. Um, Britain led the way through the Industrial Revolution, and as a result, had the most advanced and largest industrial base. So could create, the most advanced and the most stuff. They also had a vast colonies to draw resources from. Um, it was around a quarter of the globe that Britain controlled. And you can see on the map some of the different colonies and areas they controlled. If you look at the areas they controlled and kind of look at the US and their army bases now, it's pretty much the same, like very similar to the areas that they controlled. And that's because it is all about those resources and those trade routes. So that's quite interesting. There are obviously some differences, but a lot of similarities. And I put also, yeah, the vast colonies were good because, in a way, they drew resources from them. A little bit like how the West does nowadays through neo-colonialism. But essentially, what would happen would be the uh, Britain would trade, or in most cases, just take these base resources and then would use the industrial base within Britain to turn those into more advanced um, items that can then be sold. It's very similar to the neo-colonial setup, which happens nowadays, which is, for example, the US will they will establish share companies which will extract resources from countries in, let's say, Africa for dirt cheap. And then these countries will then sell those items for dirt cheap so that they can get dollars to either repay their debt and or buy more enhanced items that they themselves can't make. So, for example, they'd sell, I don't know the exact amount, but look how much iron, for example, iron ore they would sell, and then in return they'd get a fridge which uses up a fraction of that ore or those base resources, but costs a gazillion times more. And it's basically a monopoly where only the West can make these enhanced, advanced items. Um, and so you have to sell your base resources for all of this stuff that you can't make. So that's basically neo-colonialism. You keep them underdeveloped so that they can't make the stuff that you can then sell back to them at an extortionate rate, and then because they need this stuff at an extortionate rate, they end up selling their resources for dirt cheap. So that was done previously, kind of not very subtly through colonialism. Nowadays, it's done through neo-colonialism, and it's kind of breaking down this neo-colonial approach because there are other countries, like for example China, who are saying, well, actually, we'll sell you this stuff for dirt cheap as well. Um, don't get me wrong, they're still taking the resources for a lot cheaper than they should be, but not as they're not extorting as much as the West are, right? Um, in a future video, I'll go more in depth on this and we'll actually look at some figures of how many raw resources are being exported for the same value of an item that uses those resources to come back in. But anyway, tangent, apologies. But basically, 25% of the world was pretty much belonged to Britain. They could use those to get those resources and also balance their trade. And when I say balanced trade, if we think back to Triffin's dilemma, which we looked at in a previous video, which is essentially every reserve currency will eventually fail because you have to perpetually be running a deficit. Well, Britain was running a deficit, but was balancing that out because all of their colonies were running such huge surpluses, right? The likes of India, especially, were exporting so much and importing barely anything. So they were running these huge surpluses, which prevented Triffin's dilemma from affecting Britain. So that's essentially how Britain ended up prospering over those 100 years. How did it come to an end? I said US and Germany creep on the come up. So US and Germany start outpacing Britain in their industry. So they become more modern in their industry. They started exporting a lot more as well. They were actually just investing and creating more modern approaches to energy, investing back into their industry and actually having more efficient machinery and whatnot. Britain was still, holding on to really expensive coal, but it was resourcing from within the Isles. While meanwhile, the likes of the US and Germany were focusing a lot quicker and pivoting to gas and oil, which was cheaper and more efficient. So Britain was just getting outdated, losing their competitiveness. And then again, if we look at Triffin's dilemma as well, when it comes to currency, but also expectations from the populace, you're eventually going to become uh, you're going to get to a point where you can't compete, right? So Germany also starts challenging Britain's naval supremacy as well. So starts rivaling them in some of the trade routes and some of that supremacy that they had. And I think probably one of the big reasons for this is the UK was spending a lot of money and resources both maintaining its colonies, but also being involved in wars, whether it's with China, whether it's proxy wars with Russia, which, again, if we talk about history rhyming, that's quite a funny one there. Maintaining stuff in like South Afghanistan. Um, so yeah, there was, and again, like the hustle and tussles on the seas with the likes of Spain as well. So there was a lot going on, and in a Britain was getting involved with a lot of military stuff that they shouldn't be, or didn't have to be. Then, in addition to this as well, civil unrest was led by higher prices, stagnant wages, especially leading up to World War One as well. There was civil unrest with the trade unions because they saw their quality of life diminishing. And this, as you become more and more uncompetitive, you don't have the luxury of paying people so much more. And as other people start being able to make these items, you can't, you don't have that monopoly, so you can't just, extort everyone across the globe and pay your workers. Not that they were really paying their workers, but pay your workers to some degree, should I say? Well, they were starting to lose this, which was causing unrest with the trade unions. You had the suffragettes, you had the issues in Ireland as well. So there was a lot of civil unrest as well. And to be honest, even before World War One, Britain was losing its grip. It was losing the workshop aspect. It was no longer producing the most, which was driving the demand for pound, for being, for controlling all of the trade. So it kind of pretty much was breaking apart before World War One. It led inexorably to World War One, and perhaps we'll go deeper into it another time. But I think that Britain's downfall, and as Britain started getting a bit more desperate, is what caused some of the alliances and some of the issues, which ended up sparking World War One. Well, World War One ended up causing a huge spike in debt. You can see on the graph. Destruction of infrastructure and industry, which put them even further behind. Not so much Germany, because obviously Germany was still involved, but especially the US, because mainland US didn't get touched. And the UK ends up removing its peg between the pound and gold in 1914. And I would say World War One, like it's over now. Um, I would say this is a point where the US, it still hasn't, if you look at the graph, if you look at how much the US dollar is being traded versus the pound, and who's holding pound versus US dollar, technically up until the end of World War Two or 10 years after World War Two, technically the pound is still the reserve currency, but past World War One, it's just a formality. Like it's all over. The UK quote unquote won the war, but they didn't. They lost. The US won. Interwar period between World War One and World War Two. Pound gets repegged to gold in 1925 to try and salvage some of the strength and some of the fluctuations in the exchange rate. You can see in the graph some of the issues which obviously would have caused the repeg there. It doesn't end up being able to hold it for very long. The pound loses that peg to gold again in 1931, and the dying kind of desperate calls were the introduction of the sterling area, which was a very sizable portion of the world. But I think that as Britain and the pound became so uncompetitive on a global market, especially in comparison to the likes of the US and Germany, they just created their own world, and they were like, okay, look, we'll invest and we'll trade within this world that we've created, and we'll try and protect ourselves from the likes of, the US in particular, who were just competing at such a high level. But the sterling area, introduced in 1931, originally for the likes of guarantee and exchange currencies. ensuring favorable access to capital and investment. A lot of the funds and investments would be managed and kept managed from London, and it eventually turns into a protectionist measure with the likes of tariffs for people outside the sterling area, but being able to trade inside. A little bit like how what is happening nowadays, right? Where you have these Western countries which are like, look, we're just gonna um, start tariffing everyone who we can't compete with, and then we're just going to everyone who are equally as inefficient and equally as expensive, we're just going to trade amongst ourselves, and that's going to be fine because we're still competitive against each other. We're just not competitive against Russia, China, um, India to some degree, ASEAN. So, uh, yep. And then we lead into World War II, which I mean, at this point, the system is all but dead. But we have World War II, piles on even more debt, even more death and destruction, which hinders the industry further. It culminates in the Bretton Woods Agreement, where this is where it's made official, right? Everyone says, okay, everyone's going to peg their currency to USD, USD to gold, and everyone's going to trade in the USD. And then the final nail in the coffin, the piece which Britain would never ever be able to recover from, no matter what, would be the loss of India in 1947, which I think would be equivalent to the US losing control of all of its proxies in the Middle East. Um, and again, we spoke about why India was so important to kind of get around Triffin's dilemma, to balance out some of the trade issues, but also to get those raw resources back to the UK, where they can then be manufactured into high-end products. And everyone sees the writing on the wall. The pound ends up being dumped for USD, and I believe sometime in the 1950s, early 1950s, USD is then technically the reserve currency. Um, so yeah, that's the story. In terms of the starter kit or the checklist, I guess, for a downfall of a global system or global hegemon, I thought we'd just list them out and see kind of how they compare to what we've seen so far or what's happened in the US. First one is loss of manufacturing and energy supremacy, which we've definitely already seen this. It's no surprise that the US has, for a while, lost this to China, not only in low-end goods but also in high-end goods as well. China is the global leader both in the manufacturing but also in energy as well. They're far ahead in terms of the green transition, in terms of exploring like thorium reactors and new age kind of energy technologies. And again, the parallel is there with the UK still relying on, expensive coal. Meanwhile, everyone's using gas and oil. That's kind of what we're looking at now. And what's quite funny as well is the UK was kind of still trying to make it work with dwindling and expensive coal from their own territories. A little bit how the US is trying to do that with shale. But yeah, the dominance has been lost. Over involvement in foreign military interventions. I think we can all agree that that has happened already. If you look at the likes of Iraq, Afghanistan, um, yeah, definitely. Loss of control over trade routes. I think this one is still ongoing. I think the Belt and Road Initiative by China is still trying to vie for control. I think for the most part they are there, but we've still got a little bit of a way to go. But if you take a map of all of the countries and their biggest trading partner, pretty much everyone outside of some of Europe are now trading primarily with China, not the US. Increased civil conflict. Obviously, there is some in the US, but I think that they still have a ways to go. I think it still would have to get worse before that's a factor where we can compare it to what was happening in Britain. Weakening currency and inflation. This kind of happened in the last stages of the collapse of the pound system, and I think we're only just starting to see that in the US. Inflation is it jumped up to double figures, but has been put down to about 3.8%. I think it is now, somewhere around there, but it's going to go back up as well. They've recently just announced that they're going to start cutting interest rates because they can't keep them elevated any longer. So we're going to see that inflation come into the dollar, and the currency is weakening. It lost, what, 12% so far this year or something ridiculous. So we are seeing it, but it's only just happening now. Increased debt, I think, has happened a lot sooner in this cycle than happened to Britain. Cross-border payments and global reserves in other currencies. I think we're still very early days with this one. I would say that everything on the list, this one is the earliest days, but yeah, we are seeing a flight to gold and other currencies, and we are seeing countries starting to trade more in their own currencies, but again, there's still quite a bit to go. And the last one I put on there is war. Both the death of the French system and the death of the British system was marked by war. I think we could look at this Ukraine Russia as that war aspect, but I don't think it will be. I think it will be one of them, but I think that ultimately the war that ends this system will be the war in Iran. I think that it's either going to be the war in Iran, or it will be the proxy war with China through the Philippines or Taiwan. So it will be either one of these two. I think that the war with Russia and Ukraine, the proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, definitely have pushed it a little bit, but I think that goes more in the over-involvement in foreign military interventions rather than the kind of final nail in the coffin war, which will be what happens in Iran or what happens with China. So, yeah, I think that if we look at history, we can see that we can tick some of these off, but there definitely is some way to go. We still have a lot of changes that need to happen in the reserves being held globally and also cross-border payments. We also need to see the final war acts, which will cement the collapse, and an increase in civil conflict, I think, as well needs to happen. But other than that, I think everything else has been checked off. And yeah, obviously, it's not all going to happen exactly the same. Some things may happen that didn't happen previously, and some things that happened previously may not happen. Perhaps we managed to transition to a new system without a huge war. I'm very, very skeptical of that, unfortunately, but it could happen. But yeah, I'm gonna do some more of these. I don't want to focus too much on history, but I will have a look at some of the other previous reserve currencies and world orders and compare how they fell to our states today. I will also have a look at some of the comparisons between the what's happening in NATO versus what happened with Athens, Sparta, and Persia. And then I will. A lot of people have already done that comparison between Rome and the US and the downfall of Rome and the downfall of the US system. So I probably won't do that. But what I might do is I might actually do a version of that, but looking at some of the Chinese empires. So I might have a look at like the Qin dynasty and some of the other dynasties and compare some of the aspects of like their downfall versus the current system, because I don't think many people have done that. The Rome one is good though. If anyone's interested, go and find one of the many videos on that out there. And thank you all very much. I know this one was a little bit slower, and yeah.